In this second video on the history of American music, we'll turn to the early part of the 20th century, looking at the period from World War I through the 1950s, through the beginning roots of rock and roll. By World War I, Victorian culture had begun to fade, and ragtime had become the first African American music to be widely accepted by the larger white communities, at least among the young. Ragtime composers such as Scott Joplin, you can see him on the left, and musicians such as Jelly Roll Morton on the right, became well known throughout America. Ragtime was not the only African American music flourishing at the early part of the 20th century. Others were gospel music and the blues. Gospel music had grown from the earlier religious spirituals. Musicians such as Thomas Dorsey, and you can see him here on the left, became popular beyond simply the churches. But because he was black, he really had trouble getting a recording contract. Blues music, meanwhile, grew from the slave work songs or spirituals popular in African American churches. African Americans lived hard lives, and the music reflected this, often expressed melancholy or sad emotions more than telling a narrative. Unrequited love and poverty were enduring themes. The first blues was Mississippi blues or Delta blues. They usually employed a harmonica and a slide guitar, using a tube or object such as a bottleneck to press on the strings. Early leaders in Mississippi blues included people like Robert Johnson, you can see him on the left, and a bit later, people like John Lee Hooker on the right. During World War I, the great migration of African Americans from the rural South seeking jobs in northern cities' wartime factories meant that African American music spread as well. In Chicago, a more distinctive blues music emerged, the so-called Chicago blues. Using electrification in their guitars and harmonica while adding a strong bass, horns, and drums, Chicago blues obviously foretold a coming transition to a rhythm and blues, and still later, of course, rock and roll. Early leaders in the Chicago blues included musicians like Muddy Waters, who was popular a bit later, and later still people like B.B. King. By the 1920s, both African American and white musicians had taken ragtime and expanded it with horns. These new big bands were immensely popular in clubs throughout America's big cities. All the emerging African American music converged in the largest of the cities in the 1920s, New York City. After the Great Migration, the new African American arrivals found themselves ostracized, forced to settle high on Manhattan Island in the area of Harlem. This racism, however, ironically allowed a distinct African American culture to flourish. This Harlem Renaissance, as it became known, spanned the breadth of creative culture. In music, the big bands, gospel, and the blues, not to mention jazz, grew in popularity. Probably the most notable development growing out of the Harlem Renaissance was the emergence of jazz. Combining multiple African musical traditions and growing from ragtime, jazz added improvisation, long instrumental solos, more swing-in notes, and new instruments like the saxophone. Scat singing and call-and-response vocals were common. So popular was jazz in the 1920s that the period became known as the Jazz Age. Exhibiting all these forms of new music, Harlem venues such as the Cotton Club on the left and the Apollo on the right grew tremendously popular. Among the popular musicians was Duke Ellington, who played the piano and led a big band. Born in Washington but centered in Harlem, he had a career that started in 1923 and lasted almost 50 years. He was credited with over 1,000 compositions and won a special Pulitzer Prize for music, often noted for his role in making jazz a musical genre on par with previous forms such as classical music. The trumpeter Louis Armstrong was equally important, his career spanning 50 years as well. His trumpet was known for its lively sound, they said. Among the famous big band leaders of the Renaissance, and a man that again had a long career, was Cab Calloway. There were a lot of female singers in jazz and blues. One of the more famous was Bessie Smith, who was sometimes called the Empress of the Blues. She sang and danced and did comedic sketches and really influenced a whole generation of singers. There was Billie Holiday, who was nicknamed Lady Day, and she was a famous singer and songwriter whose career spanned 30 years. She pioneered new ways of manipulating phrasing and tempo and influenced a number of future female singers such as Lena Horne and Ella Fitzgerald. The growth of music like gospel and blues was an example of folk music, at least until commercialization, publication, and the big recording companies took over. It grew from the grassroots, from particular communities, in the case of gospel and blues, the African American community, and it reflected the traditions and the varieties of those communities. There were, of course, other examples of folk music that had roots that extended back deep into American history. Reflecting traditions from the Great Plains and the poor white community in Middle America, for example, was the singer Woody Guthrie. Using an acoustic guitar to craft socially and politically poignant messages, often protest music, Guthrie became famous as perhaps the best known American folk singer. His popularity soared in part because during the Great Depression of the 1930s, so much of his community was suffering. The infamous Dust Bowl ravaged the land and white poverty grew. During World War II, his music attacked fascism, and you can see that in guitar here on the right. Guthrie's music just reflected all of this. Perhaps his best known song was This Land Is Your Land. Another folk tradition, bluegrass music, grew from the poor white community near the Appalachian Mountains. Bluegrass often incorporated banjos and fiddles and emphasized the offbeat and a more rapid tempo, which made it more high energy. It also incorporated a lot of vocal harmonies. Bluegrass often incorporated a folk dance style known as clogging. Another form of folk music, Cajun music, grew from the ethnically polyglot area of southern Louisiana. Growing from French-speaking Acadians who had immigrated from Canada early in American history, and combining influences from the area's Creole population, Cajun music was also upbeat with its use of a rapid staccato rhythm and reliance upon instruments such as the accordion, fiddle, saxophone, piano, and a washboard known as a rub board. Often referred to as zydeco, Cajun music was also a popular dance music. With the growing music recording industry of the 1940s, all these forms of music underwent a sort of renaissance as Americans heard music they'd never had before. World War II brought Americans together and exposed them to regional traditions and culture, music included, that they'd not experienced before. All of this in turn contributed to the growth of the recording industry. Also influential was, of course, the spread of radio, which had the power to suddenly make songs nationally known. World War II was the first war when there was a widespread use of musical recordings, and music not surprisingly played a key role in maintaining morale and in winning friends abroad. Swing jazz was particularly popular with the young soldiers, and the United Service Organization, or USO, even arranged concerts for the troops. In one notable instance, the big band leader Glenn Miller, and you can see him on the left down there, who joined the military to lead the Army Air Forces band, which was itself known for swing jazz, died when his plane went down, shocking Americans across the country. After World War II, the United States continued to use music as a form of cultural diplomacy during the Cold War. The Soviet Union seemed so dull and controlling, while American music, particularly American swing jazz, seemed so thrilling and fun. Music was an obvious way to influence people in non-aligned countries. Below are two recent scholarly books on the use of American music during the post-World War II years. After World War II, the economic prosperity and the continued growth of the recording industry, combined with the new industries of television and the movies, influenced and amalgamated the direction of American music. In the broadest sense, many white folk traditions overlapped into what people termed country music. Although regional variations still existed, ballads and the use of steel guitar were common characteristics. While Bristol, Tennessee is considered the birthplace of country music because of some early recordings, the country recording industry eventually settled in Nashville, which today is often considered the center of the country music scene. In fact, beginning in 1950, Nashville promoted itself as Music City, USA. One reason for Nashville's popularity with country music was the Grand Ole Opry, which popularized the national barn dance. First on radio and then television, Americans from coast to coast were exposed to forms of country music, which became a distinct industry with its own charted hits. One strain of the new country music was Western music, popularized by the singing cowboys seen in many post-World War II movies. Singing cowboys such as Gene Autry on the left and Roy Rogers on the right became nationally famous, as much a result from their movies as their music. Western music had more of a swing with popular live shows and so-called honky-tonks. Distinctive Western dance, such as line dancing, often helped define this strain of the new country music. With other forms of music centered in New York and Los Angeles, for many Americans, country and Western music was spoken of as one and the same, under the same umbrella. In the post-World War II years, the economic prosperity in the movie industry also spread the popularity of musical theater. Many plays, for example Camelot and South Pacific, were made into movies. Musicals by the dynamic playwriting duo of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein contributed, most notably in plays such as Oklahoma, which further added momentum for generic country music. Perhaps Rodgers and Hammerstein's most notable musical was The Sound of Music, which was also made into a famous movie. Music was popular in the movies as well, and in the post-war years, singers often crossed the line into acting. Many became quite famous, most notably Frank Sinatra, shown here on the left, whose distinctive baritone voice made people call him the Voice. After tremendous recording success, Sinatra earned an Oscar nomination as an actor. The amalgamation and growth of American music after World War II was hardly limited to country and Western musicals. In many urban centers, such as New York, younger musicians transformed jazz, moving away from the swing of the war years into what became known as bebop, which mixed complex chord progressions with rapid changes in key, scale, and tempo to expand what jazz meant. While bebop could demonstrate instrumental skill and even longer improvisation than before, it was no longer danceable and demanded really close listening. Bebop's challenge to musical structure attracted the young urban rebels of the 1950s, the so-called beatniks who had begun to reject conformity and materialism of the age. Bebop, unconventional poetry, drinking, and the emphasis on experiences rather than wealth characterized these beatniks. Meanwhile, in cities such as Chicago, electrification was transforming the blues. Electric guitars and bass with new expanded horn sections became popularly known as rhythm and blues, or R&B. R&B adopted some of the swing of earlier jazz and commanding vocals, but still expressed the African American experience. The transformation of the blues to R&B was evident in numerous African American musicians. For example, from left to right, the pianist Ray Charles, the guitarist Bo Diddley, and the singer James Brown, among many others. One notable recording studio where a number of blues and R&B recordings was made was the Muscle Shoals Sound Studio in Alabama, which today is on the National Register of Historic Places. By 1960, R&B had continued to evolve, mixing in gospel singers such as Aretha Franklin with backup harmonies and more pop-friendly melodies to create what became known as soul music. In some ways, soul music was an inevitable commercialization of R&B. Popularizing soul music was the recording studio of producer Berry Gordy Jr. in Detroit. Since Detroit had earlier been known as Motortown for its automobile production, soul music often became known as Motown, and all of this, of course, is laying the foundation for modern rock and roll. In any event, this concludes the second video on the history of American music from the early 19th century to the roots of rock and roll in the 1950s.